This was the life of a New York City police officer in the USA. In June of 1975, travelers arriving at New York City's airports were handed a pamphlet by men in uniform. The pamphlet had a skull on the cover. It was titled, "Welcome to Fear City, a survival guide for visitors to the city of New York." Inside it said, "Stay off the streets after 6 in the evening. Avoid public transportation. Never ride the subway for any reason whatsoever." In the South Bronx, which police officers call Fort Apache, arson has become an uncontrollable problem. Good luck. The men handing out those pamphlets were not muggers or anarchists. They were members of the police and firefighter unions of New York City, distributing a document designed to pressure the city government into reversing the layoffs it had just announced. Layoffs that would eliminate thousands of police officers and firefighters at the precise moment the city's crime rate was reaching levels that had no precedent in its history. The pamphlet was a provocation, and it was also a completely accurate description of what New York City had become. From 1970 to 1975, the homicide rate in New York City had more than doubled. The number of robberies had tripled. Entire neighborhoods in the South Bronx, Harlem, and Brooklyn had become places where the absence of functional city services, the collapse of the housing stock, and the concentration of poverty and open drug markets had created conditions that overwhelmed conventional policing entirely. Between 1970 and 1983, 104 New York City police officers were killed in the line of duty. What was it like to be one of the men and women who showed up for work inside that city every day, knowing those numbers? New York City's 1975 fiscal crisis was not a background condition for the officers of the NYPD. It was the defining operational reality of their working lives. By spring of 1975, the city had accumulated $14 billion in debt and was running an operating deficit of more than $600 million. Unable to borrow, the administration of Mayor Abraham Beame announced the largest municipal layoff in the city's history, including the dismissal of nearly 5,000 police officers in a single fiscal year. The NYPD, which had peaked at more than 31,000 uniformed officers in the early 1970s, would fall to approximately 22,600 by 1980. The department had lost roughly a third of its force, while the rate of serious crime in the city rose 40%. The math was not complicated, and the people doing the arithmetic were the officers left behind. Each remaining officer covered territory that had previously been split among more people. Response times lengthened. The 911 system, which had been introduced in the late 1960s with the intention of improving emergency response, had in practice pulled officers into a reactive posture, chasing calls after crimes had already occurred, with too few people to maintain any meaningful preventive presence on the streets between calls. A precinct that should have had 6 patrol officers working a sector during a given tour might have 4, covering the same ground for the same pay with the same equipment, which was itself aging, in many cases outdated, and maintained on a budget that reflected the city's inability to spend money it did not have. Now, before we continue, comment below if you have ever worked in a dangerous job. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. The South Bronx in 1975 was a place that required a specific kind of preparation before an officer could understand what he was walking into each shift. The borough had experienced an economic collapse that had begun in the early 1960s and accelerated through the decade that followed, driven by the departure of manufacturing jobs. The construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway that cut through established neighborhoods and displaced tens of thousands of residents, and the subsequent disinvestment by landlords who found it more profitable to collect insurance on abandoned buildings than to maintain them as housing. The result, by 1975, was a landscape of burned-out shells, vacant lots, and structures in various stages of abandonment, covering entire city blocks in neighborhoods that had been functional residential communities a generation earlier. The officers assigned to the precincts of the South Bronx, particularly the 41st Precinct on Simpson Street, which had acquired the nickname Fort Apache from the officers who worked there, operated in conditions that were unlike anything in the experience of American urban policing. The precinct house itself had been the target of gunfire from the surrounding buildings. Officers working the South Bronx responded to shootings, stabbings, and arson calls with a frequency that veteran officers elsewhere in the city found difficult to believe, on streets where the population had contracted, but the violence had not, in buildings that might or might not have structural integrity. At hours when the street lighting, if it existed, might or might not be functioning, the daily patrol in a high-crime precinct in New York City in 1975 began with roll call, the assembled officers of a tour receiving their assignments, any information relevant to the sector from the previous tour, any wanted persons or vehicles to watch for, any specific conditions in the precinct that the commanding officer wanted addressed. Then the officers went out. In 1975, most patrol was done in radio cars. 2 officers in a marked patrol vehicle, covering a defined sector of the precinct, available to respond to 911 calls and to handle any conditions they encountered on their own initiative. The radio was constant. The dispatcher's voice coming through the receiver was the rhythm section of the tour. 1085, requesting backup. 1030, robbery in progress. 1010, possible shots fired. 1052, dispute. And an officer's ability to interpret that rhythm, to know from the dispatcher's voice and the address and the code what he was actually going to find, was a skill that developed over years of listening and responding and arriving at scenes that matched or didn't match the information the radio had provided. The paperwork that surrounded each call, the arrest report, the complaint report, the aided card, the voucher for any property recovered, was extensive, done by hand, filed in triplicate, and took time that the volume of calls did not always accommodate. The specific danger of working the streets of New York City in 1975 was concentrated in particular circumstances that experienced officers learned to identify and manage with varying degrees of success. Domestic violence calls, in the language of the era, family disputes, were among the most dangerous routine assignments a patrol officer faced. They arrived at residences where the emotional volatility was highest, where the parties were known to each other and to the responding officers in ways that complicated the dynamics, and where weapons that were not visible during the call were sometimes produced without warning. Drug locations, the street corners and apartment buildings that had become open markets for heroin and later for other substances, were places where armed men operated under their own rules of enforcement, and where the arrival of a patrol car disrupted economics that some people were willing to defend with violence. The robbery patterns of the era, purse snatches in the subway, muggings at ATMs, the follow-home robberies that targeted people coming from check-cashing establishments, were high-volume crimes that generated enormous numbers of calls and consumed enormous patrol resources without producing arrest rates that had any visible deterrent effect on the underlying behavior. The homicide rate in 1977, 2 years into the fiscal crisis, showed firearms as the cause of death in 56% of all cases, a 5.6% increase from the previous year. Firearms were everywhere in the city, and the officer who went to a call in 1975 had to assume that the situation he was walking into involved at least the possibility of a weapon that he had not yet seen. The 1977 blackout was the event that compressed everything that had been building in New York City across the preceding decade into a single 25-hour window. On the evening of July 13th, 1977, a lightning strike on a Hudson River substation triggered a cascade of failures that plunged all 5 boroughs into darkness. The power outage hit a city that was already at a breaking point, in the middle of a 9-day heat wave that would become the hottest in New York City's recorded history, with a serial killer known as the Son of Sam still at large after killing 6 people over the previous 18 months, with unemployment high, with municipal services depleted, with a population that had absorbed years of declining city services and rising crime without any visible indication that conditions would improve. When the lights went out, the restraint that had been holding went with them. More than 1,600 businesses were looted across the city. More than 1,000 fires were set. More than 4,500 people were arrested in a single night, a number that overwhelmed the city's jail capacity and required officers to process arrests in improvised holding facilities. The NYPD officers who worked through that night did so without adequate backup, without adequate equipment, covering ground that had previously been handled by a department 1/3 larger than what remained. The neighborhoods that were hardest hit, the South Bronx, Bushwick and Brooklyn, Harlem, were places that were already operating without adequate police or fire coverage. The blackout did not create those conditions. It simply made them undeniable. The equipment that an NYPD officer carried in 1975 was limited by the standards of what would come later and adequate by the standards of what was available then. The service revolver, in most cases a Smith & Wesson Model 10 chambered in .38 Special with a 6-round cylinder, was the standard sidearm. It held 6 shots and was reloaded by hand with loose rounds or speed loaders. The body armor that would eventually become standard issue for patrol officers did not exist in a practical form for regular patrol use in 1975. The Kevlar soft body armor that would later be adopted by departments across the country was in early development during this period, but was not yet in widespread use in New York City Patrol. An officer who was shot in 1975 was shot without the protection that would eventually save thousands of lives. The patrol car's radio was the primary communication tool, supplemented by the handheld radio that most officers carried, but that were not always reliable in the building environments. The stairwells, the elevator shafts, the interior apartments, where much of the actual police work happened. The Detective Bureau's investigative resources were stretched thin by the volume of serious crimes and could not give every homicide or robbery the attention that a lower volume environment would have allowed. The families of NYPD officers in 1975 lived with an awareness of risk that had no counterpart in the experience of most American households. The spouse of a patrol officer working a South Bronx precinct in 1975 knew, without anyone needing to articulate it, that the statistical probability of her husband being shot in any given year was meaningfully higher than it had been 5 years earlier, and significantly higher than it was in any precinct not located in the highest crime sections of the city. The department's funeral rituals for officers killed in the line of duty, the flag-draped casket, the honor guard, the hundreds of officers in dress uniform standing in rows outside the church, were not abstract ceremonies to the families of patrol officers. They were events that these families had attended, sometimes more than once, for people they knew. The department did not, in 1975, have a systematic program for supporting the families of officers killed in the line of duty, or for providing mental health services to officers who had been involved in shootings or who had witnessed traumatic events in the course of their work. The expectation was that officers would process what they experienced through the informal mechanisms available to them: their partners, their crew, the specific gallows humor that develops in workplaces where death is a professional reality, and continue to function at the level the job required. The 1975 crisis was the low point, but it was not the bottom of a curve that would immediately reverse. The conditions that produced it, the fiscal collapse, the reduction in force, the concentration of poverty and violence in specific neighborhoods, the absence of resources adequate to the scale of the problem, persisted through the remainder of the decade and into the early 1980s. The NYPD did not begin its long recovery until the early 1990s, when a combination of increased hiring, new policing strategies, and broader social and economic changes began to produce sustained reductions in crime that no one in 1975 would have predicted were possible on the timeline they actually occurred. The officers who worked through the worst years, who patrolled Fort Apache and the South Bronx precincts and the Harlem streets and the subway tunnels during the decade when New York City was genuinely ungovernable in parts, did their work without adequate resources, without adequate protection, and without any clear indication that the conditions they were working in would improve within the span of their careers. Some of them were killed, many more were injured. All of them carried what they had seen in the specific way that people carry things they cannot put down and have not been given tools to process. The city they served eventually became, by the early 21st century, one of the safest large cities in the United States. That transformation was built on many things. Among them were the years those officers put in when the city had given them almost nothing to work with and needed them most. The transit system of New York City in 1975 was a world unto itself, and the transit police officers who patrolled it operated in conditions that differed significantly even from the already difficult environment of surface patrol. The subway had become, by the mid-1970s, one of the most feared public spaces in the United States, a place where muggings occurred with sufficient regularity that experienced New Yorkers developed specific behavioral adaptations for riding it, including standing near the conductor's car, avoiding empty cars, and not displaying anything worth stealing. The Transit Police, a separate department from the NYPD that would not be merged into the main department until 1995, patrolled the stations and cars of a system that carried millions of passengers daily through tunnels that were dark, loud, and difficult to communicate in, on platforms that offered limited escape routes for both officers and victims, and in cars where a violent confrontation between an officer and a subject took place in a confined steel box moving at speed through a tunnel. The crime rate in the subway system tracked the surface crime rate, rising through the 1970s, reaching its peak in the early 1980s, and then declining, eventually dramatically, as the city's broader conditions improved. The transit officers who worked those years did so in an environment that amplified every difficulty of street patrol and added several that were unique to underground policing. The question of what 1975's New York City police officer took home from the job, not in terms of compensation, which was adequate by the standards of blue-collar work in New York at the time, but in terms of what the work deposited in his body and his mind over the course of a career, did not have a clear institutional answer in 1975. The department had a chaplain corps and a departmental psychologist for officers in crisis, but nothing resembling a systematic program for the kind of ongoing occupational mental health support that the research of subsequent decades would identify as necessary for people doing high trauma work at sustained volume. Officers processed what they experienced through the available mechanisms: their partners, their families, the specific culture of the precinct, and the personal resources they brought to the work. For some, those mechanisms were adequate. For others, they were not, and the consequences accumulated in ways that did not become visible until years or decades after the events that had produced them. The officer who had worked Fort Apache through the worst years of the 1970s, who had responded to more shootings and stabbings and fires and domestic violence calls than he could accurately count, carried that history in his body and his mind long after he retired. The department did not have a formal way to acknowledge that, and the culture of the era did not provide a language for discussing it. It was simply understood between the men who had been there without being said. The officers of the NYPD in 1975 were not unique in American policing for working in difficult conditions. Officers in Detroit, Chicago, Washington, and other major American cities were navigating their own versions of the same fiscal pressure and crime wave. What made New York distinctive was the scale, the sheer size of the city, the density of its population, the depth of the fiscal crisis, and the particular concentration of social dislocation in specific boroughs that had no equivalent anywhere else in the country. The South Bronx of 1975 was not a neighborhood in decline. It was a neighborhood in the final stages of a complete physical and economic collapse, and the officers assigned to it were being asked to provide law enforcement services in conditions that had more in common with a post-disaster environment than with the ordinary difficulties of urban policing. That they did it day after day with the resources the city had left them, at the personal cost that the line-of-duty death and injury statistics documented, represents something worth naming clearly. Not heroism in the abstract. That word has been applied so broadly that it no longer means much. Something more specific. The daily decision, made by thousands of people in a city that had failed them in material ways, to show up anyway, to take the call, to go to the address, and to do the work that the job required, regardless of what the fiscal crisis had done to the conditions under which it had to be done,